Some stories have a natural gravity that pulls you in until there is no turning back. Experience the weight of every choice and the momentum of a destiny that cannot be stopped. Click subscribe now and let the pull of great storytelling take you away.
He was already pouring himself a glass of whiskey when I walked through the front door. My father had been dead for 6 hours. I remember standing in the hospital hallway at 2:47 in the morning, watching the nurse pull the curtain closed, thinking, someone needs to call my uncle. Someone needs to handle the arrangements. Someone needs to be the grown-up right now. And then I realized that someone was me. It had always been me. By the time I got home, my uncle's car was already in the driveway. Not my uncle's house, my father's house. The house my grandfather built with his own hands in 1974. The house my dad grew up in. The house where I learned to ride a bike on the cracked concrete path out front. The house my father promised me would always be home. My uncle, my father's younger brother Dennis, had a key because my dad trusted him. Because family meant something to my father. Because my father was a good man who believed the best in people, even people who had spent 30 years proving him wrong. Dennis was on the leather couch, shoes off, feet on the coffee table, whiskey in hand, television on. He looked up when I came in, and for exactly 1 second something crossed his face that I can only describe as inconvenience. "Hey kid," he said, "rough night." I was 29 years old. I had just watched my father take his last breath, and Dennis called me kid. I want you to understand something about my uncle before I go any further. Dennis is the kind of man who has always believed that the world owed him something it never quite got around to delivering. Growing up, my dad was the responsible one, the one who went to college, built a career in commercial real estate, bought the family home from my grandparents when they got too old to maintain it, made sure everyone had what they needed. Dennis was the one who borrowed money and forgot to pay it back, who showed up at holidays with a new girlfriend and a story about a business deal that was just about to close. He never meant harm, my dad used to say. He just never grew up. What my father didn't know, what I didn't know until it was almost too late, was that Dennis had grown up just enough to be dangerous. My dad's name was Robert. He was 61 years old. He had a heart condition that we'd known about for 2 years, managed with medication and stubbornness, and his deep personal conviction that if he just kept moving, kept working, kept showing up, nothing could touch him. He was wrong about that. He died on a Tuesday in October, and the last thing he said to me was that the azaleas out front needed trimming, and he kept forgetting to do it himself. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that went cold, going through the mental checklist that grief hands you whether you want it or not. Funeral home. Death certificates. His attorney, a man named Gerald who had handled my dad's affairs for 20 years. The will. I knew what the will said. My dad had told me clearly 2 years earlier when he got his diagnosis. The house would come to me outright. His investment accounts split between me and a charitable trust he'd set up for a local literacy program he cared about. There was a small bequest for Dennis. Enough to be generous, not enough to be foolish, my dad had said with a tired smile. He knew his brother. What I didn't know was that Dennis had known too, and that he had spent those 2 years preparing. I called Gerald's office first thing the next morning. His assistant told me he was in court but would call me back by end of day. I thanked her and hung up and went to find Dennis in the kitchen where he was making eggs like he lived there. "I'm going to start reaching out to the funeral home today," I told him. "I'll handle everything. I just wanted to let you know." Dennis cracked another egg into the pan. "Actually," he said, not looking at me, "I've already made some calls." I waited. "There's some financial stuff we need to talk about," he said. "Your dad had some debts. Business debts. It's complicated. I've been helping him manage some things the last year or so, and there are some obligations that need to be settled before the estate can be distributed." I looked at him. He was still watching the eggs. "What kind of obligations?" I asked. "It's complicated," he said again. "But the short version is, we might need to liquidate the house to cover them." He said it casually, like he was telling me the weather, like the house my grandfather built was a line item on a spreadsheet. I said, "I'll talk to Gerald." Dennis finally looked at me. "Gerald's getting old," he said. "I'll talk to Gerald." Dennis finally looked at me. "Gerald's getting old," he said. "He might not have the full picture." I nodded. I said, "Okay." I went upstairs to my father's office and I closed the door and I sat very still for a long time. And then I started looking. Here is what I knew about my father. He kept records of everything. Every receipt, every contract, every letter. His filing system was color-coded and meticulous and mildly insane. And I had made fun of it for years, and in that moment I was more grateful for it than I can say. I knew exactly where to look. It took me 4 hours to find the first discrepancy, a withdrawal from my father's main business account. 14 months ago, $42,000 transferred to an LLC I didn't recognize. Denwell Property Solutions. I pulled up the state business registry on my phone. Denwell Property Solutions had been incorporated 16 months ago. The registered agent was a woman named Carla Whitmore. I didn't know who that was. Not yet. I kept looking. Over the next 72 hours, while I was also planning my father's funeral, accepting condolence calls, making sure the obituary was correct, and greeting the steady stream of neighbors and colleagues who came to pay their respects, I found 11 separate transfers, spanning 14 months, totaling just over $310,000, all of them to Denwell Property Solutions. All of them initiated, according to the account records, by a secondary authorized user on my father's business account. Dennis had been added as an authorized user 19 months ago. 3 months before Denwell was incorporated, I went back through my memory trying to find the moment I must have missed. When had Dennis become involved in my father's finances? My dad had mentioned once that Dennis was helping him think through some property investment opportunities. I had half listened, because Dennis's schemes were a background noise I'd long since tuned out. I hadn't asked questions. I hadn't looked closer. My father was a smart man. I trusted him to handle his own affairs. What I hadn't accounted for was that Dennis had spent 2 years very carefully making himself indispensable, helping with the accounts, sitting in on calls with vendors, learning the systems, building access. And when my father's health started declining, when the medication made him foggy on bad days, when he was tired and overwhelmed and just needed someone to handle things, Dennis handled things for himself. I did not confront him. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to walk into that kitchen and put every document on the table and ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. I'm not a confrontational person by nature, but I'm not a quiet one either. And there is a specific kind of rage that settles into your chest when someone has stolen from your dying father, and I felt every degree of it. But I thought about what my dad would have done. My dad, who was meticulous, who kept records, who believed that if you were going to do something, you did it right. He wouldn't have walked into that kitchen. He would have built the case first. So I built the case. I called Gerald's office again and left a message asking to meet privately as soon as possible without mentioning the reason. Gerald called back that evening and I drove to his office the next morning and laid everything in front of him. He read through it slowly. He's the kind of attorney who doesn't show much on his face, and for a long moment I couldn't tell what he was thinking. Then he said, "This is elder financial abuse under state statute, and depending on how those transfers were authorized, whether your father actually consented to them, we may be looking at wire fraud." He pulled out a yellow legal pad and uncapped a pen. "Tell me everything," he said. From the beginning. I told him everything. What I didn't know then, but Gerald helped me understand over the following 2 weeks, was that Dennis had taken it further than the transfers. While I had been focused on the financial accounts, Gerald's forensic accountant, a quiet, precise woman named Patricia, who wore reading glasses on a chain and treated fraudulent documents the way a surgeon treats an infection, had found something else. A deed transfer, filed 8 weeks before my father died, when he was in the hospital for a 5-day stay following a cardiac event. A transfer of the family home from my father's name to a joint tenancy between my father and Dennis, with right of survivorship, which meant that when my father died, the house would pass automatically to Dennis, bypassing the will entirely. My father's signature was on the document. It was a forgery. I didn't scream. I want you to understand that. I sat in Gerald's conference room and I looked at that document and I felt something settle in me. Cold and clear and very, very calm. Because here is the thing about a forgery. It is not the end. It is evidence. And evidence, properly handled, is a door. Patricia had already flagged the signature for forensic analysis. A handwriting expert she worked with regularly, a retired FBI documents examiner, had reviewed it and prepared a written opinion that the signature did not match my father's known signature samples and showed signs consistent with tracing. Dennis did not know any of this. Dennis thought he had been very clever. What Dennis was careless, smart enough to see the opportunity, not smart enough to understand the exposure. He'd forged the deed when my father was incapacitated and couldn't object. He'd drained the accounts through an LLC he thought was obscured enough to be untraceable. He'd positioned himself in the house, made himself comfortable, started talking about obligations to lay the groundwork for why the estate was complicated, why assets needed to be liquidated, why things were not as straightforward as my father's will suggested. He had a plan. It just didn't account for the fact that I had my father's filing system, Gerald's 20 years of experience, and Patricia, who could find fraud in a document the way other people find typos. He also didn't account for me. Here is what I had that Dennis didn't: time, patience, and the absolute certainty that I was right. I had grown up watching my father work. I had watched him close deals, navigate disputes, handle difficult people with a steadiness that I had spent my whole life trying to learn. My dad used to say that the person who controls their emotions controls the room. I thought about that every single day for the 3 weeks between finding the first discrepancy and what happened next. Dennis was still at the house. He had made himself at home in a way that would have been almost impressive if it weren't so enraging, reorganizing the kitchen, taking calls at my father's desk, once suggesting that we should think about updating some of the furniture. He was performing the role of executor, of man of the house, of the person in charge. I let him. I was polite. I made coffee. I answered questions vaguely and watched him settle deeper into a confidence that had no foundation. Gerald and Patricia filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office and referred the wire fraud component to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. This is not as slow a process as people imagine when the documentation is clean and the amounts are significant. Patricia's records were immaculate. The forensic handwriting analysis was unambiguous. The transfer records from Denwell, once subpoenaed, showed that the money had gone directly to Dennis's personal accounts, with a portion to Carla Whitmore, who turned out to be his girlfriend of 2 years. A fact he had never once mentioned to my father or to me. The morning it happened, I was in the kitchen when Dennis came downstairs. He was dressed nicely. He had somewhere to be, some meeting I didn't ask. He poured coffee and checked his phone and said something about needing to get the locks rekeyed, which I noted without responding to. There was a knock at the door. I knew who it was. I had known since the night before, when Gerald called to let me know the timing. I had slept better than I had in 3 weeks. I opened the door. There were 2 federal agents. Behind them, a local detective. Gerald was parked at the curb. He had driven over personally, which is not something attorneys typically do, and which told me something about how he felt about what Dennis had done to a man he'd known for 20 years. I stepped aside. Dennis turned around from the kitchen counter with his coffee mug and his phone and his very expensive shoes, and he looked at the agents, and then he looked at me, and I watched the confidence leave his face like air out of a tire. Not all at once. Slowly. Then completely. One of the agents introduced himself. He mentioned wire fraud. He mentioned the forged deed. He mentioned the unauthorized transfers. He mentioned that Dennis had the right to remain silent and that anything he said could be used against him. Dennis said, "This is a misunderstanding." He looked at me when he said it. I didn't say anything. Here is what I have learned. In the 1.5 years since that morning, I have learned that grief makes people do things they might not otherwise do, and that includes both the grieving and the people who see grief as opportunity. I have learned that the documentation my father kept so carefully, the color-coded files I had mocked for years, were the single most important thing he left me, not because of what they contained, but because of what they proved. That he was a careful man, a thorough man, a man who understood that the record of a thing is as important as the thing itself. I have learned that patience is not passivity, that waiting is not weakness, that there is a kind of power in knowing what you know and letting someone else keep digging the hole they're standing in, deeper and deeper, while you hold the evidence and wait for the right moment. Dennis was indicted on 7 counts, including wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and filing a forged instrument. The case is still working through the federal system, as these things do. The forged deed was voided. The house is mine. The estate was restored, less the legal fees, which were significant but not as significant as $310,000. Carla Whitmore cooperated with investigators. I don't know what her deal was, and I decided I don't need to know. The azaleas my father mentioned, The last time I spoke to him have been trimmed. I did it myself in November in the cold, and I cried the entire time, and I don't apologize for that. My father used to say, do it right or don't do it. He meant work, contracts, due diligence. He meant the filing system and the carefully worded agreements and the patience to build something properly instead of grabbing at it. I think he also meant this. He meant when someone comes for what's yours, don't scream, don't threaten, don't tip your hand. Build the case, then walk through the door.